Hi YouTube, welcome back to Wtf Rc Cars. So we're carrying on with the build of the M-07 Concept. We've got the front bill and the steering, so I think we'll be starting by fitting the motor. So let's bring you in for a close-up look and crack on with build, see how far we get. Right, so first thing we're going to need to do on this one, we've got as motor, which it's going to be racing the 27 turn class, so Core RC 27 turn motor. We need to put the pinion on, so I'm going to get this so it's just tightened down, stop it sliding about too far. And then we've already got the caliper set to 17mm, so we just need to slack this off ever so slightly and get it down to 17mm. So you want a 17mm gap between the top of the pinion and the base of the motor. So for this next part, we've got to put the motor in, and you need to pay attention to where the screw holes are on it. So you want one at top, one at bottom. We've got to slide the motor in from the back, line it up. Not sure if you'll be able to see in there, but there's basically two holes. And then we've got to get the screw in, and we'll start tightening that up. And then we're going to want another of these machine head screws and a washer, and we've got to try and line them up with bottom, which is easier said than done, but damn near impossible to show on camera. So we'll get that lined up, and then you can check for your pinion mesh. So we're just going to have to back those screws out, bring the pinion mesh together, and then you're just going to want to back it off ever so slightly because you don't want this too tight. Now this is definitely an RC where it's probably going to be easier to drop a piece of paper in if you're not comfortable with setting the pinion mesh, but it is quite easy to get these in and it's quite easy to mesh it. So you don't want it too tight, but you don't want too much play in there. And if you get a good spin round, you can see if there's any tight spots or anything. This feels pretty good at the moment, so I think we'll leave it tightened up at that. But your two screws go in with your washers, and you just check, make sure your pinion's lined up. There is a hole in the bottom, and you can adjust where the pinion is. If you just spin the pinion, line it up till you get your little grub screw, you can tighten it up and loosen it through that hole. So now that's together, let's see what else we've got. Right, as next part, you're going to get this little piece, which is B5, and that's going to go in and seal our motor housing up. So it just pops in there, Tamiya logo, make sure that's on the correct way, and then you've got two little tabs that you can just pick it out with. I'm not entirely sure if that's going to stay in there very long racing, but it does tell you to put it in. And I'm not going to close that hole up on the bottom because I'm going to probably be swapping pinions as we get this on the track and see what sort of speeds it's on the straights. But let's continue to the next part. So next part we're moving on to are the shocks. So the first thing we're going to do is get one of the piston rods. On each one of these you're going to want one of these C or E clips, depending on what you want to call them. So you want to get that into place. Just make sure the back clip is all the way in. Then we're going to need one of those dampers, and I'm building this to the kit spec. So this will be number 8, or I think it's V8. So it's a single hole one. So that's got them on. Make sure when you cut this out you get the little bits off the edge of it. So once we've got that assembled, I think what I'm going to do for these is get some O-ring grease because it seems to work a bit better than just chucking oil on them. So let's get them stuck in here. And we get them covered in O-ring grease. It's probably going to be easier to drop these in first. So we want one of his O-rings in. And then we can get another of his O-rings in. So once we've got them in, I like to just screw the cap on ever so slightly. Then we can get his piston that we've assembled. And I like to try and screw these through the O-rings if you can. It does stop you cutting the actual O-ring itself. Then we can tighten that up. Just give it a quick wipe down. So you should have really smooth operating shock at this point. Then we're going to need our shock pliers. So you're going to want to grip that. And then we're going to need part V1. And you're just going to screw this onto the bottom of the shock. They screw on really nicely on these Tamiya shocks. But we've got quite a nice smooth acting shock absorber there. So you need to repeat that for the other three. So we'll get these quickly put together. Right, so moving on, once we've got our shocks assembled and make sure they all move nice and freely, we're going to need 4 of the shock caps, and then we're going to fill the shocks. So you need to start filling these nice and steadily. And I like to stop just before the top of them. So once you've filled it to top, if you move the shock in and out of its full travel, and this should help get any of the air out of it. So if you do it a good number of times, probably 4 or 5 times up and down, you'll see all the bubbles start coming to the top. So we need to get all 4 of these filled, so I'll crack on with that. So once we've let them settle and all our air has come to the top, you can just top them off. I like to get it just about level, then get one of the caps and just slide it on from the side. And let it find its own level, and for these it's telling us to build them at full extent. So then we get a cap, and don't worry if you get a bit of oil squeeze out of them when you're doing this, they're designed to do that. That way you can be pretty sure you've not got any air trapped in them. So we're just going to build the shock up, give it a good wipe down, and then you should have a very smooth action shocker. And to be totally honest, for stock plastic shocks, these do feel really, really nice. Quite impressed with these. For the stock sort of kit plastic, they do feel quite good. So I'll carry on and do the other 3 and then see what else we need. Right, so we're going to be building these this way round. The rears use the blue and 1 spacer, which will be the number 7 V7. The fronts, it's telling us to use yellow, which are the softer springs, and 2 of the spacers. So I always find it easier to get the spring on first, and then we put this V5 part on, and then drop the spring down, and you want your bigger spacer on first, and then the smaller. And then you're going to build another front exactly the same, and then the rear we want the blue springs, and then you're just going to want one of the spacers on it, and I like to leave the sort of paint on the top so you can see them easier when they're on vehicle. So we'll assemble the rest of them and then see what else we need. Right, so next thing we're going to need is two of the little ball joints, and these are just going to screw into part B11. Right, so we're going to screw these little ball joints into part B11, and these screw into the outside with the tapers showing, and it's telling us to use the innermost holes on these as the stock setting. So we'll quickly get these screwed in. If I can keep hold of this B11 with my hands covered in shock oil. But these just screw in quite easily, and these are going to hold as shocks. So you need to get them in place. Once you've got them, we need the little tapered head screws, and this is going to screw straight into the front of the chassis. So we'll quickly get that put in. We get these screwed on, and I'm pretty sure you'll be able to get either a carbon or aluminium replacement part for this, but with them being this small, they're usually really tough, and the plastic parts do have a little bit give in them. So quite often the upgrading these to sort of carbon fibre or metal, possibly not such a good idea. Then we need to get our shocks, and these should just clip on. It's a little bit awkward to get your hand in there, but they will go. So that's got one on, and I like to just try and turn the springs so they're on the outside, so you can see the colour, so you know what springs you're running. That's got one in. That's got the other in. And we have some really smooth suspension now on this car. I must admit, for a mainly plastic kit, this does feel fantastic. Certainly a huge step up from the TTO1 and TTO2. Be really interesting to see how this one runs. But for stock plastic springs and stock suspension, it really does feel nice. So, let's move on to the next one. Right, so moving on, we need to get some of these tiny little nuts, and these need to face sort of that way around, and they're going to drop inside the holes in the chassis, which is going to be easier said than done. So I'm not sure what's going to be the best way of getting these in, but they basically got to go down in there. So once we've managed to get the little nuts down inside there, you're going to need one of the longest screws and a washer, and then these are going to want to go on sort of that way round with the little protrusion sticking out, and it lines up with the lower of the chassis. And I believe these are also some of the parts that are available in aluminium. It does tell you not to over tighten these. So basically on this side you want to do exactly the same but opposite way round. And this is one of the reasons why initially I thought maybe it'd be easier to do this upside down. Why does it show you this way? But as soon as you pick it up, the little nuts fall out, and you can't really, there's not really any way to line them up. They have to sit right down in the bottom. So pretty much the only way to get these is to keep the chassis all the right way around. So once we have them in, next thing we're going to be doing is putting the body post mounts on. So these are keyed. They can go that way or that way depending on what body you're putting on, but initially I'm going to try these stepped backwards. So these are the tapered head or countersunk screws. And we just need to get the second one in place. So that's what you should end up with. You got the bits that hold your suspension arm on and the body mounts. So let's move on. Right, so moving on to the suspension arms. I think the first thing I'm going to do is get the little ball joints fastened in. And I do find when building these things it helps to just lay the parts out as they're going to be assembled, and it just stops you making sort of daft little mistakes and forgetting parts. And it also, especially when you get to parts like this where you're building the wheelbase, or it affects the wheelbase, it's nice to just lay them out and then you know exactly sort of which way round you're building them, and you're building them the correct way basically for both sides. So get this right. I'm sure it faces in like that. And this is also somewhere where you could upgrade these little spacers. They'd look like 1mm. In fact, let's have a look. Well, 1.23mm. So I'm pretty sure you could get some aluminium replacements for these. And then finally, on both sides, you're going to need the tiny little set screw or grub screw. And it screws in front bottom, and it's telling you to leave it stuck out 1mm. Now, I'm not entirely sure on which way round these are going to sit on the RC yet, but it's telling us to leave them 1mm, and it's showing that they screw in from the bottom. So I'm really hoping that they fasten on the RC the other way and we can still get to set screw. But that's one built up. We're going to do exactly the same with opposite side. So first thing we're going to need to do on this is get two of our little ball joints screwed into the top. So you're going to want these two screwed down, one there, one there. So I get them screwed in. Right, once we've got them screwed on, we've got the lovely task of getting yet two more of these tiny little nuts to drop down inside holes in the chassis. Then I quite like the way they've done this, so you can basically adjust your toe on the rear of the RC by shimming it. So you want the bigger washer on the outside, then you screw through, and then the stock build asks for two little washer shims, and these should control the toe in, or the toe in or out depending on how you set it up for the rear of the car. Then we just need to lift that into place, and then if it lines up right we should be able to get this to screw in. It looks about right, so you do have a little locating pin again on the D4 part, and it's just a case of getting it to line up. And I must admit, there's very little play in that suspension. It's shaping up to be a really impressive little build, this, for a Tamiya or Tamiya car. I must admit, it's certainly exceeding my expectations of what the quality of this kit would be like. There are some parts that slightly confuse me, and I must admit I've never driven or set up a front wheel drive little M chassis car for a long time, and certainly not of a sort of race quality. So yeah, this is the first one of the newer sort of M chassis that I've built up, but in all the Tamiya touring cars and the normal touring cars that I've built, you tend to go for softer springs on the front. Softer springs on the rear. But I'm pretty sure, looking at this kit, it's telling us to go softer on the front. Not sure how this is going to run, because you generally want more grip on back. But I'm going to build it, other than the odd few little parts that I've changed, like the diff. I'm going to build it to how the kit suggests building it, and then try it and see if we need to swap these shocks around. But I'm pretty sure it's telling us softer on front than back, and that just seems a bit weird. Might be right for these M chassis cars though. So let's move on. Right, so these are the next parts we're going to be building up. You've got K3 and then 4 screws. Certainly would be a place to drop a little bit of weight with it being front wheel drive. You could drop a little bit of weight in if you needed more weight over the rear, but that just drops into place. Then we've got us 4 screws to put in. So we got one going there, another drops through that one, and then we just have the 2 rear ones to drop into place. And this is also where you drop the grub screws in for the optional sway bars. I'm not sure if I get to end at kit. If I've got them grub screws left, I'll probably drop them in front and rear just so I know where they are. But let's continue onwards. So we're now moving on to assembling the hubs. So we've put a little bit of the hoodie oil onto the bearings. So we're going to need 2 of the smallest shims, and these slide onto our drive shaft or axle, whatever you want to call this bit. Then we're going to want a bearing. Then you're going to want your C2 part as a spacer, and then just like on the front ones, we've had to drill a 2.5mm hole out of the bottom on both these hubs. So we're then going to want to get our little stub axle through. Then we're going to want a bearing from the front. And then it's telling us we need the 0.5mm shim on the outside. And this basically stops your hex running on the outer race of the bearing, makes it run on the inner race. And then it's telling us to put a pin through. But that is our hubs assembled. So moving along, we basically have the little grub screw that we can just get started in either side hub, and these are what's going to hold your suspension pin in, so we can get them started. Then you're going to need one of these little ball joints screwed in, one for the left and one for the right. So we'll quickly get these put in. So you got your hubs complete, and then we just need to make up these lovely little turnbuckles. And I am slightly confused as to why they've put adjustable turnbuckles, but they're not the ones that you can adjust with like an adjustment spanner. But basically, we're looking to tighten these down. You want one end facing down, one end facing up, and you want a 3.6mm gap between it. So I'll get these built up now. Right, so moving along to the suspension. So you've got basically your suspension bar or pin, and you're going to pop that in. You want the flat to be facing out. So then we get us hub in place, and it's just a case of wiggling these around till it actually goes in. But once you've got that through, then you're going to want to tighten your little grub screw, and you don't need to go crazy tight with this. We're just looking for it to hold the actual suspension pin, so you don't need to over tighten them. If you do, you've definitely got a risk of splitting the hub itself. And again, with this kit, I am hugely impressed with the lack of slop in anything. So once we've got that in place, you're then going to want to clip your little tie bars in. And then we've got some rear suspension built. So let's crack on. Right, moving on. Just noticed a quick error I'd made, so I'm not sure what difference it makes because they're both 5mm, but it tells you to use the ones that screw in with the hex from the top on the suspension and these on the actual shock tower mounts. So I've swapped them over. They are both 5mm, so I'm not really sure what difference it makes, but just in the interest of trying to build it correct to the manual. So the next thing, we're going to need part B12, and then you've got 2 of the little taper head screws, and these just screw the shock tower on. So we'll quickly get that into position, and then it's turn us to go for the outermost position on the shock tower. So we just need to get these 2 ball joints screwed in. I'm not really sure why they give you different ones. Don't know if these sit further in, smaller collar on bottom possibly, but that's the ball joint screwed on. So we've come to the end of part number 27, building the rear suspension this way round, and this is for the 239mm. Just noticed that we're a little bit higher than the other one. So I believe this is building it to the 239mm, and if you want 225, you build them the opposite way round. But let's carry on with build. So we're at the part now where we just need to clip us rear shocks on. Again, I think it's a little weird that it seems to tell us to run the softer on the front than the rear. It's not the way round I'd expect it to run, but then again, I've not run a M-07 fronter yet. But that's a pretty impressive little kit, especially as though they're not the most expensive. But I think in the interest of keeping these vids to a sensible level, I shall wrap this one up here. So there we have it, continuing on with the M-07 build, and I must admit I have been really impressed with this so far. The lack of slop in anything, and just how positive the actual steering feels and how smooth, really is shaping up to be a very nice RC. Also, quite like the way you can adjust the toe angle on the rear, so you could shim it either side to adjust it straight or put it at an angle. Quite like that. I think on the front, if I'm not mistaken, I think you could get some different blocks. I think they do these in aluminium, possibly, and I have seen a lot of these little suspension parts in aluminium. Not sure if they're necessary or if they're just a sort of a nice to have. But yeah, really enjoyable build so far. But if you're enjoying this build as much as I am, don't forget to like and subscribe, share to friends and family, and hit the notification bell to see us carry on with this build. And catch you guys again in the next one.